The entire class froze when Miss Hawthorne pointed at Jamal and said, "Since you keep tapping on your desk like a drummer, why don't you play us something on the piano?" Her tone was sharp, mocking. It was not a request, it was a setup. Jamal, just 12 years old, looked up from the back row, confused. He had never even touched the school piano. But the smirk on Miss Hawthorne's face said everything. She expected him to fail. She wanted him to fail, in front of everyone. Before we dive deeper into what happened next, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the bell icon. This is a story you will never forget. Jamal's classmates giggled as he slowly stood up. Some whispered, some just stared. The piano sat in the corner of the room like a trap waiting to be sprung. He walked toward it, each step heavier than the last. He could feel eyes burning into his back. The teacher folded her arms, ready to enjoy the show, thinking this poor kid was about to embarrass himself. But Jamal had a secret even his closest friends did not know, and Miss Hawthorne was about to regret everything she just did. As Jamal sat down on the piano bench, the room buzzed with anticipation. A few students even raised their phones, eager to capture the humiliation they expected to unfold. Miss Hawthorne leaned against her desk with that same cold smirk plastered on her face, arms still crossed, her head tilting ever so slightly, enjoying every second before the storm. But Jamal's hands did not tremble. He placed his fingers gently on the dusty keys, closed his eyes, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, with a breath as steady as stone, his fingers moved. Not randomly, not nervously, but with purpose, with power. The first notes that floated through the classroom were soft, haunting. Then came the rush, a melody so complex and passionate it seemed to pour out of his soul like a confession. The music swelled with emotion. It was not a song he had practiced. It was something he had composed, from memory, from pain, from years of quietly sitting in that very class, being underestimated. The students who had been laughing now stared with wide eyes and open mouths. A few slowly lowered their phones, forgetting entirely they were recording. The sound was too powerful, too real. Miss Hawthorne stood up straight, her arms falling to her sides. Her face changed. The confidence vanished. Her eyes locked on Jamal's hands as if she could not believe what she was witnessing. This was not a prank. This was not lucky. This was genius. Jamal had learned to play piano on a broken keyboard in his grandmother's basement. His grandmother, once a music teacher before her school closed down, had taught him everything, every chord, every scale, every emotion behind the sound. For years, they played together in secret because Jamal was too embarrassed to share it at school, too afraid he would be mocked for liking something not cool enough. Now, he was not just playing, he was performing, and the teacher who tried to shame him was frozen in place, watching a child become something she could not define. One of the students whispered, "Is this real?" Another muttered, "How did we never know?" But no one dared interrupt him, not even the girl who had rolled her eyes at him that morning, not even the boy who always sat in front and never spoke to him. Every note Jamal played told a story, of being overlooked, of being doubted, of being silenced. But now he was louder than ever. Miss Hawthorne tried to speak, but nothing came out. She had humiliated him publicly, and now she was the one left speechless. As the final note echoed through the classroom, Jamal lifted his hands gently from the keys. A long, eerie silence followed, so complete you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. No one clapped. No one moved. They were still processing what had just happened. The boy they expected to laugh at had just played like a concert pianist. Miss Hawthorne finally blinked, trying to regain her authority. "Well, that was unexpected," she muttered, reaching for her attendance sheet as if pretending nothing had happened. But the shakiness in her voice betrayed her. She had been exposed, not just for underestimating Jamal, but for targeting him out of bias. Jamal turned around slowly, eyes locked on the teacher. Calm, composed. "Is that all, ma'am?" he asked. No arrogance, just power and restraint. Before she could answer, the classroom door creaked open. The assistant principal, Mrs. Bennett, stepped inside. She'd been called earlier that morning to observe the class due to several parent complaints about Miss Hawthorne's behavior. What she had just heard from the hallway had stopped her in her tracks. "I heard everything," Mrs. Bennett said, her voice strong. "And I would like to have a word with you, Miss Hawthorne, privately." The students gasped. Some exchanged looks. Others turned their eyes to Jamal, who stood up, shoulders squared. It was not just his talent that stunned them. It was the way he carried himself. Dignity, calm, control. Miss Hawthorne, on the other hand, looked small now, caught, flushed, trapped in her own classroom. "You may return to your seat, Jamal," Mrs. Bennett said, giving him a nod of respect. "And thank you for that performance." Jamal nodded silently and returned to his desk, every step echoing with quiet victory. For the first time in a long while, his classmates looked at him not as someone different, but as someone extraordinary. The door clicked shut behind Miss Hawthorne and Mrs. Bennett, leaving the class in stunned silence. Then whispers began to ripple across the room. "Dude, that was insane," one student muttered. "Why didn't he ever say he could play like that?" whispered another. Jamal sat silently, pulling out his notebook like it was just another day. But deep inside, his heart was pounding. Not from nerves, but from years of quiet frustration finally breaking free. He had always known his worth, but this time, so did everyone else. In the hallway, Mrs. Bennett's voice could be heard through the door, low but firm. "You embarrassed yourself, not him. You crossed a line and there will be consequences. This school will not tolerate racism, Miss Hawthorne. Not on my watch." Inside the classroom, a shift had taken place. Jamal was no longer just the quiet black kid in the back row. He had become a symbol of silent resistance, strength without noise, talent without showboating. And for some students, it was the first time they truly saw the difference between power and prejudice. Then the classroom door opened again. But it was not Miss Hawthorne who walked in. It was the principal. Mr. Cranston, an older man known for rarely visiting classrooms unless something serious had happened, stepped in with a stern expression. He scanned the room, eyes finally landing on Jamal. "I would like to see Jamal Harris in my office," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. Another wave of tension swept through the room. Was he in trouble? Was he being praised? No one could tell. Jamal stood up slowly. Again, no fear, just quiet readiness. He walked out of the room with the principal, not knowing that what waited for him down that hallway would change everything. As Jamal walked beside Principal Cranston, the long hallway felt heavier than usual. Every step echoed like a drumbeat of questions in his head. He had done nothing wrong. He had played the piano. That was it. But the look on Mr. Cranston's face, it was unreadable. They entered the principal's office, and to Jamal's surprise, Mrs. Bennett was already there, sitting beside a man he had never seen before. The man wore a dark tailored suit, a silver lapel pin glinting under the fluorescent light. He looked important. Mr. Cranston closed the door gently behind them and gestured for Jamal to sit. The suited man leaned forward, smiling. "Jamal, my name is Mr. Langston. I'm with the National Youth Arts Program. Your principal sent me a clip of your piano performance." Jamal's eyes widened. "He did?" Cranston nodded slowly. "I asked a few students to share the video they recorded. It was remarkable." Langston continued, "You have a gift, young man. We are offering you a full scholarship to attend our summer program in Washington, D.C. Top mentors, top training, and a chance to perform at the Kennedy Center." The words hit Jamal like thunder. "But why me?" "Because you earned it," Langston said firmly, "not just with talent, but with grace under fire." Mrs. Bennett beamed with pride. "You turned humiliation into power, Jamal. That is not just music, that is character." Jamal sat in stunned silence. Not long ago, he was the boy mocked in front of his class. Now, he was being handed an opportunity that could change his life. But just as the weight of it all began to settle in, there was a knock on the office door. It was Miss Hawthorne, her face pale, her voice trembling. "May I speak to Jamal for a moment?" Mr. Cranston raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that is appropriate?" I think I owe him an apology." Everyone turned toward Jamal, waiting. He stood slowly, looked her in the eyes, and nodded once. "Okay." But what she was about to say was not what anyone expected. Miss Hawthorne stepped into the room, her hands tightly clasped, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. The usual firmness in her tone had vanished. "Jamal," she began, her eyes unable to meet his, "what I said, what I did in class, was wrong. Deeply wrong." Jamal said nothing. She looked at the others, then back at him. "I did not ask you to play because I believed in you. I asked you because I thought you would embarrass yourself. That was cruel. And that cruelty came from a place in me I now see more clearly than ever before." Mr. Langston narrowed his eyes slightly. "Why now, Miss Hawthorne?" She exhaled shakily, because when Jamal started to play, it was not just music, it was something else. I saw every assumption I had about him shatter with every note, and I knew, in that moment, I had made a fool of myself. Jamal finally spoke. "You did more than embarrass yourself. You made me feel small, in front of everyone." She nodded slowly. "I know, and I cannot undo it, but I want to make it right." There was silence in the room, the kind that demands truth. "I am stepping down," Miss Hawthorne said suddenly. "I have submitted my resignation. I have requested the school bring in a new music teacher, someone who sees students, not stereotypes." Mr. Cranston's face twitched in surprise. He clearly had not heard this news either. "I am also donating my final paycheck to the National Youth Arts Program in Jamal's name," she added. Jamal looked up. His hands were trembling slightly. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you reminded me of something I forgot," she said, her voice cracking. "That teaching is not about control. It is about belief. And I failed you." She turned toward the door, but before leaving, she looked back one last time. "Thank you for playing anyway." And then she was gone. The news of what happened in Jamal's classroom spread across the entire school within hours. Students who barely knew him before were now stopping him in the hallways, giving him nods of respect, pats on the back, even shy words of admiration. Teachers whispered quietly in lounges, reevaluating their own behavior, their own biases. Some approached Jamal with awkward kindness, Others simply observed from a distance, unsure how to respond to what had unfolded. But something had changed, something deeper than a teacher resigning. Jamal had not just stunned them with his talent, he had cracked open something buried beneath the surface of that school. The assumptions, the silence, the quiet racism that had existed in glances, in lowered expectations, in missed opportunities. That evening, Mr. Langston sat with Jamal and his mother at their kitchen table. He had come by with a stack of documents, a look of excitement in his eyes. "I made some calls," he said, setting a brochure down in front of them. "The New York School for the Arts has an early admission program. They usually do not consider students until senior year, but after hearing your performance, they are willing to make an exception." Jamal stared at the brochure like it was something from another world. "They want me?" "They need you," Mr. Langston said with a smile, "and the world needs to hear what you played today." Jamal's mother wiped a tear from her eye, her hands clutching his gently. "I always knew, baby. I always knew." The living room felt lighter, the air filled with something that felt like possibility. For the first time in a long time, Jamal looked not just proud, but ready to be seen, not as a stereotype, not as a symbol, but as who he truly was. 2 weeks later, the auditorium was packed again, but this time Jamal stood center stage by invitation, not as a joke, not as a punishment, but as the guest of honor. A grand piano sat beneath the spotlight, polished, majestic, waiting for him like an old friend. Parents, teachers, students, even district officials had gathered, all curious to see the boy who had turned a moment of humiliation into something extraordinary. Jamal walked to the piano with steady steps. No fear, no shame. He looked toward the front row where his mother sat with Mr. Langston beside her. He saw respect in the eyes of every face staring back at him, even those who once ignored him. He took a deep breath and played. Not just music, but a message. A sound that carried every moment of silence he had endured, every stereotype he had crushed, every word he never got to speak. The melody rose and soared, filled the room with truth, pain, beauty, everything that had ever been buried. When he finished, the room erupted, not in polite applause, but in a standing ovation that shook the walls. Even Principal Harris stood, teary-eyed, clapping with both hands. Later that evening, an envelope was slipped into Jamal's mother's hands, an official scholarship offer. Full ride, prestigious academy. No one dared mock him now. Jamal had walked into that classroom a boy underestimated. He walked out a young man whose voice would never be silenced again. Not by ignorance, not by prejudice, not by fear. Because when they tried to shame him, he responded not with anger, but with genius. And it spoke louder than any insult ever could.